Okay. Can I hope that thing is going to disappear.
Meeting being recorded. Just
Okay, it disappears, right?
no, just say okay. Just click on okay.
Where is it? Here? Oh, it's gone.
It's here.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm ready whenever.
Yeah, I'm also ready whenever. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. It's still afternoon. We have the curtains down, but it's not night. Thanks for being here, and thanks, Oskar, for being here. I'm very happy to introduce to you all Oskar ARNÓRSSON. He's a dear friend from Iceland, but mostly he's a very much esteemed colleague that has recently discussed a brilliant PhD thesis at the University of Columbia, New York, on topics that he's going to explain us today, the architecture of the Marshall Plan, and I have here the title of your thesis, which is quite long and I can never remember it by heart. The architectures of the Marshall Plan in Europe, France, Greece, Germany, 1948 to 1952 and beyond. Just let me give you a brief introduction to Oskar. Oskar is an architectural historian and an architect as well. He is a historian, let's say, of the transnational governance of architecture and the built environment, with an emphasis on mid-20th century intergovernmental architectural and environmental practices. Oskar has studied in Copenhagen, in New York, has taught in Iceland, and has co-chaired a very important conference, the Third Ecology Conference, that was held in Reykjavik 2 years ago, of the EHN, which is the European Architectural History Network, which is a very prominent network for architecture historians. In the dissertation that he recently discussed in New York, and which I also guess also in this talk today, Oskar looks at how the US governed Western Europe, so to say, through the built environment after the Second World War. I also think Oskar will tell us why he first got interested in this topic, so in the processes of the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program, which resonates also a lot in the built environment of Reykjavik and Iceland, where Oskar comes from. Oskar researched in different European contexts, as we will see, weaving together a history that is transnational and moves across countries, institutions, and different actors, and a history which, as Oskar writes, moves between representation and performance, and which I think will be very inspiring for the many PhD students here in the room, but also to the many master students that are here, and thank you for being here and support this brilliant lecture series. Thanks to the organizers of this year. I think this is one of the lecture series that makes our department quite special in the, let's say, the Italian panorama. So Oskar, the floor is yours, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Sophia, for the incredibly generous introduction, and to the organizers of this prestigious lecture series, and to the institution for bringing me here. This is an opportunity to unfold some material from my dissertation that has never been presented before. So it's going to be very interesting to see if I can somehow make it speak while also reducing such a large kind of constellation of material down into a small lecture. So I hope sometimes some details or actors will not be missing from what you need to know in order to understand. So if there's anything that ever passes you by, make sure you ask me questions. I'm very open to being quite informal, and I'm going to be switching from registers of being, you know, quite formal reading and then over to kind of explaining. If there's any time that you would like to ask me some questions, feel free to. Everyone can hear me okay? Thank you. I'm going to begin by reading a quote. Without a sound economy, there will probably not be much, if any, construction. The demand for architectural service may diminish within our lifetime. We therefore watch with interest activities, some of which at first glance may not appear to be strictly within our field. For instance, the Marshall Plan, or as it is now known, the European Recovery Plan, ERP. So far, ERP is little more than an idea and one that is not quite yet coherent. It will shortly be made more so. Its pattern will become clear. It will require implementation. It will force an adjustment of our economy to the salvation of the European economy. This adjustment will not be avoided unless the United States should declare itself to be an absolute isolationist nation, in which event the period of our enjoyment of isolationism would, I think, be singularly short and its ending unhappy. Now, these ominous words spoken in 1925 were written by Edmund R. Purves, the director of the American Institute of Architects, in an article titled Government Relations in the January 1948 Bulletin of the American Institute of Architects. Now, Purves' purpose was to explain the resolution to the architectural profession so it could calibrate its needs and wants to the expediences of the Cold War. Writing 3 years after much of the US productive capacity went into the war, and with demobilization still in train, Purves did not know what would come next. The US was facing global headwinds with the deteriorating economic situation of its allies and the ongoing Greek Civil War. The House Committee on Un-American Activities saw threats of unknown proportions on the domestic front. Further conflict loomed abroad, potentially extending architects' mobilization for the war. This mobilization could become permanent. The face of the profession could change. Purves wrote earnestly that, quote, an architect's call in life is to render architectural service to his client, unquote, but that for, I quote, continuation of architectural service, the profession must be actively aware of the condition of the world in which it works, unquote. The implication was that the government was the architect's new client. According to Purves, quote, architects as individual citizens, unquote, were free to, quote, engage in whatever activities they desire and to adopt and follow out whatever ideologies may be to their individual likings, unquote, as long as they were not un-American. Being a spokesman for the AIA, Purves qualified his remarks, stating that they reflected only those, quote, interests and activities to which the resolution pertained, those fundamental philosophies of government. At this time of crisis, Purves explained that it was difficult to determine at what point the interests of the organized profession cease. Purves then discussed the Marshall Plan in detail before predicting increased federal direction in American participation in the international picture, and that this direction might even extend into state and municipal governments. Now, for the remainder of the article, Purves took a domestic turn. He claimed, remarkably in hindsight, that it's safe to assume that to return to free enterprise is of scant promise, and that it has become little more than a catchword, free enterprise. While Purves allowed that there, quote, may be opportunities created for the increased flow of individual initiative and private enterprise, he asserted that, quote, any return to the unconfined economy of even 25 years ago is patently out of the question, unquote. Purves concluded with a lesson about self-government, that the construction industry must control itself or the government will control it through its failure to manage an economy which appears to be running away with it. Now, I will not analyze the article further. I discovered it at the beginning of the research for my doctoral dissertation, The Architectures of the Marshall Plan in Europe, hoping that by following PERVS and the AIA along the archival grain, I would find a wealth of such American architects' ideas about the reconstruction of Europe after World War II, and material about their rich engagement in the Marshall Plan. This would allow me to tell a story about how architecture governed transnationally, my primary interest, at a critical moment when the US laid the lines for global governance. How did architects participate in this governance? What might these architectures of the Marshall Plan be? Now, what I found was disappointing, but not for long. PERV's brief speculative words were among the few I found in the architectural press written by an American architect about architects' potential participation in the Marshall Plan. Now, before I go further, I thought I would give a primer on the Marshall Plan, formerly called, like PERVS explained, the European Recovery Program, often foreshortened to the ERP. And I will use the names Marshall Plan and ERP interchangeably. Now, the Marshall Plan was a US-sponsored program designed to reconstruct the economies of 17 Western and Southern European countries to create stable conditions for democratic institutions. US Secretary of State George C. Marshall introduced it in a speech at Harvard University on June 1947, and US President Harry Truman signed it into law in April 1948. The Marshall Plan lasted for a little under 4 years until December 1951, when the Eisenhower administration abolished the Economic Cooperation Administration, the ECA, which was the US government agency that administered the Marshall Plan, and established the Mutual Security Agency, or MSA, in its place. So I hate to do this to you, but you're going to have to remember these. So ECA is the organization that administers the Marshall Plan, and then the MSA is the one that will replace it, the Mutual Security Agency. And the Mutual Security Agency, the MSA, continued many of the former initiatives. Are you familiar more or less with the Marshall Plan? Is this something that is common knowledge, or yeah? People frequently remember the Marshall Plan for bringing $13.3 billion US, the equivalent of $175 billion in 2025 dollars, to the participating countries, as well as for financing the reconstruction of their built environments. But it went beyond these goals. While the Marshall Plan did provide relief and recovery for Europeans, it also served economic, political, and strategic interests of the United States. Economically, the Truman administration realized that the US needed trading partners abroad to maintain economic growth at home. This meant reconstructing its European trading partners and reintegrating them into a multilateral world trade system. Basically the opposite of what is happening right now. Politically, this meant establishing an open international economy based on the principles of liberal capitalism, such as free trade and equal opportunity. The Marshall Planners, as I call the amalgamation of administrators and government officials who furthered the objectives of the Marshall Plan, equated this with democratic forms of government in contradistinction to the autarchical and zero-sum economic policies of totalitarian regimes. And then there were the strategic interests that aimed to keep Germany down militarily and the Soviets out of Western Europe. The Marshall Planners addressed these interests, and in so doing, they went beyond physical reconstruction, therefore. They intended to build on top of the old European state system, a system that fulfilled the economic, political, and strategic interests of the United States on the European continent. The entity was based on the American principle of federalism to create an integrated European economy. Again, the objectives were economic, political, and strategic. The strategic objective was to reconcile Germany and France and make them economically interdependent to prevent further conflict, thus creating a balance of power to contain Soviet power in the East. The economic objective was to mirror the American experience, where a large domestic economy consisting of free market forces and strong central institutions would lay the groundwork for a new era of economic growth and social stability, a theory sometimes referred to as customs union theory. A political promised land of the so-called United States of Europe would recreate these conditions for any European state that wanted to belong to them. Besides creating a framework for controlling the Germans and containing the Soviets, it would dissolve class tensions through the newfound abundance supplied by economic growth and set the continental countries on the path to a multilateral system of world trade, the same multilateral system the current Trump administration is doing everything it can to dismantle. Now, just for a sense of how much money was involved, so 13.3 billion US dollars in 1947, which is the equivalent of 175 billion in 2025. It's not as much as one might think. Lend-lease to the UK during World War II, when the US basically financed Great Britain by giving them money for access for their, and the US gave the UK gave the US access to their bases, made up 393 billion, which is more than 10 times the total amount the UK got under the Marshall Plan. And then as of March 2025, the US had sent the same amount of funds to Ukraine as it did to all ERP countries under the Marshall Plan. And then some more comparisons. China has spent 1 trillion, almost 6 times the Marshall Plan amount, on its Belt and Road Initiative since 2013, approximately 100 billion a year to the US's approximate 43 billion a year. And the COVID stimulus is currently at more than 25 times larger than the Marshall Plan in today's dollars. But of course, that's for domestic purposes, so maybe that's not really comparable. So what was the Marshall Plan then? In folk histories of post-World War II reconstruction, the Marshall Plan plays an almost outsized role, incommensurate with its relatively modest sum. In many European countries, we have commemorative funds like the German Marshall Fund. We have institutions like the Marshall House in Berlin and the Marshall House in Reykjavik, Iceland, where people remember the Marshall Plan fondly. And one of the reasons that people remember the Marshall Plan for kind of, it's because of the memory of sheer destruction, I think. In hindsight, it seems almost obvious that Marshall aid would have somehow single-handedly been responsible for rebuilding war-torn Europe, but it's not that simple. It also seems obvious that after the Marshall Plan was introduced, the European countries were set on a path of economic growth and prosperity that would last the next 30 years, the so-called Trente Glorieuses, as they became known in France after Jean Frouillastie's work of the same name, which also corresponds with the kickoff of the so-called Great Acceleration, often timed at the same time. But how did it work and what did it accomplish? The Marshall Plan counterpart funds unboxed. Now, in my dissertation, I identify a series of what I call Marshall Plan mechanisms the ECA developed to accomplish its goals through the techniques of the built environment. The mechanism that I wish to unbox with you today is the mechanism of the counterpart fund. The US did not simply give money to European governments so they could do what they pleased. Instead, it delivered American goods to participating countries, these governments then sold the commodities to businesses and individuals who paid the dollar value of the goods into local currency counterparts into an ERP account in the respective country's central bank. I don't know what that would be here. I should have found out before I came. So Italy would have had the same arrangement. Now, this held three advantages. American goods arriving in Europe did not need Europeans to part with precious dollars, which narrowed the dollar gap that strangled European reconstruction, because Europeans couldn't buy for American goods because they didn't have dollars to pay for them. And the European currencies were almost worthless, which meant that the US couldn't sell any of their goods to Europe. Another reason was the accumulated funds could be invested in long-term reconstruction, as happened in France or Germany, or to pay off debts, as in Great Britain. And the third benefit was that payments in local currencies limited inflation by removing them from circulation while they were held in the special accounts. So this is a kind of a cartoon. There are hundreds of these types of cartoons published in every national case imaginable. But my favorite is this one that I believe I shared with you. If I did not, then even better. It shows how an it's an Austrian brochure that shows how a sack of wheat becomes a building. Now, if you follow the frames, you see that in the first frame, the US sends a sack of wheat to Austria, excuse me. Second, the US hands the sack to the Austrian government. Third, the Austrian government sells the wheat to Austrian mills, receiving Austrian shillings in return. That one. Which it then deposits in the counterpart fund. The German and the Austrian name for the counterpart fund is the ERP Sonderkonto, the ERP special account. Can you see these frames? Yeah. Fourth, mills and bakers sell bread to the Austrian public. Fifth, the Austrian government draws up reconstruction plans. It pays for with its shillings. And the ECA verifies that the plans are necessary and economical, as you can see here. Sixth, the ECA released the counterpart funds accrued with the sale of wheat. And seventh, the reconstruction plans become reality. The scaffoldings go up. Here, just as an aside, is a kind of a documentary trace of how this happened for a fertilizer plant in Iceland, where I'm from. Just this is kind of a little bit outside of I didn't even include this in the dissertation, but I just think that it's kind of interesting to see. So in the first document, we see that due to her special agricultural conditions, Iceland probably is more dependent on nitrogenous fertilizers than most other countries. So kind of an analysis of what Iceland needs. Then second, there is a conception of the Iceland fertilizer project in the middle. And then to the far right, there is the economic co-op, the ECA giving permission for the project. And then the project as built just outside of Reykjavik, where it provides fertilizer for the Icelandic countryside, rendering the countryside productive, something that I hope to follow up on in further research at some point. So therefore, contrary to common assumptions of the Marshall Plan, in most cases, the US did not hand over a single dollar for reconstruction. Instead, it simply sent these dollars to US producers, so into the pockets of US farmers, let's say, to maintain employment in the US as it rejiggered the economy from military to civilian production. And just think of it, it's completely the opposite of what they're doing now. so there's unemployment in the US hinterland. And in order to make these people work, instead of putting up tolls so they can produce work for domestic consumption, they literally did completely the opposite. They paid their own producers for things that they could then ship elsewhere, you know. So it's a complete opposite action to what's happening right now. So these were the first manifestations, therefore, of Marshall aid entering European ports at commemorative events in bales, sacks, and crates, stenciled as required by the Marshall Plan administrators with the ERP logo. Here hilft der Marshallplan, or here the Marshall Plan is helping, something along those lines. It kind of changed in each country. So therefore, if we go back to our cartoon, the cartoon was missing kind of a critical first frame where the US buys the wheat from the farmer. Just visiting it here for a second. Where the US buys the wheat from the farmer with US taxpayer dollars. And because this frame is missing, a veil of altruism obscures the domestic politics that lie behind the cartoon and perhaps the Marshall Plan itself. And this altruism is what I hope to unveil for you, or unbox, let's say, by examining one case study, miners' housing in the German Ruhr. Is everyone following? Yes? Any questions? No? Yes? One more time? Yes. So because, let's say, we're in Italy, and Italy has only lira at the time, and the currency is almost useless, hyperinflation, and so there's nothing that can be bought for the lira. So the only currency that works in the world is the dollar, which means that everyone is trying to get dollars. So dollars become even more and more expensive, which is also bad for the export economy, which means that domestic producers in the US, at the same time as the military is all coming back from Europe. So all the young men of America are coming back to Europe, and they're finding factories that are no longer producing bombers, and they need to start producing consumer goods instead. But no one can buy the consumer goods because Europe's don't have any dollars. So what do? The US simply buys tractors, coal, potatoes, oil, anything that it wants from US producers, which are then very happy because all of a sudden they have lots of employment, they get paid, they get to enjoy the American dream that we see from the 1950s that Donald Trump is always somehow evoking. Then they give the tractors to, let's say, Italy. Italy then sells the tractor in lira to you, and you go and you farm your land. So the farmer gets a free tractor, basically. He doesn't get a free tractor. He gets. I'm getting confused. He sells the tractor for lira. The lira goes into the ERP special account, which is then now controlled by the ECA, which are the Marshall Planners. So now the Italian government can come again and say, now we want to apply for a train station, or we want to build housing, or we want to build this or that. And then the US administrators can choose whether or not to donate to those projects or not. So that's kind of how the money almost does double work. It does work in the US for the domestic economy, and it does work in Italy for the Italian government. But that's how it spends the money. It ultimately spends the money that. No, I accidentally took my microphone off. So do you understand better now? Is this clear? Now, in Germany, the counterpart fund worked more or less as described in the cartoon. By paying for American production in Deutsche Mark, German manufacturers strengthened the newly formed Deutsche Mark against the dollar by paying these Deutsche Mark into the special accounts at the German Reconstruction Loan Corporation, which still exists today. Now, from here, they would circulate again. The German government and private industry would apply for loans from the Reconstruction Loan Corporation for investment in the local economy. After having first appeared on the docks as sacks of wheat, Marshall aid manifested itself again in the built environment, adorned with the plaques commemorating that hier hilft der Marshallplan. Now, like the sacks of wheat before them, if I go back to those, the buildings, therefore, functioned as armatures for displaying Marshall aid, just like the sacks of wheat. But beyond serving as visual markers, they also functioned as instruments of American influence. US administrators controlled which investments counterparts funded, since all applications for counterpart funds had to go through the ECA administration in Germany, and this was the practice all over Europe. The buildings therefore embodied the US administrators' wishes in both transportable and built form, and their walls continue to shape German subjects to this day. Unlike elsewhere in Europe, the West German housing reconstruction effort was hardly underway until 1949. As late as 1950, West Germany faced a shortfall of 6 million dwellings caused by war damage, refugee influx, lack of building in the interwar period, and failure to accommodate for population growth. Since the state was too weak to address the housing problem, this responsibility befell local authorities. Without a centralized government and a stable currency, reconstruction remained fragmented. To counter this fragmentation, the Federal Republic of Germany, which I will just refer to as the FRG, established the Ministry for Housing Construction and implemented the first housing law of the Republic in April 1950, aiming to build as many as 1.8 million dwellings, or 300,000 dwellings per year, 25,000 per month, worth of Soziale Wohnungsbau within 6 years. Dwellings suitable for broad sections of the population in terms of size, equipment, and rent, particularly for displaced persons and those who had lost their homes during the war. Of all the projects the Reconstruction Loan Corporation and the ECA were concerned with, housing construction had the strongest and longest lasting political influence, although it varied in form over the years. It was through housing construction that the ECA found its greatest influence by controlling and the refinancing of 81.5 million Deutsche Mark for housing construction. ECA guidelines reserved the funds for dwellings for refugees, expellees, and war victims, as well as workers employed in productive sectors who could not find housing near their workspace. The ECA required that the dwellings followed modern standards of building and living. One historian has called this propaganda value, but I would also like to posit that all architecture is a form of propaganda. It always speaks somehow on behalf of those who commission it. Beyond the markings demanded by the ECA on all buildings that received Marshall Plan funding, ECA funded housing spoke on behalf of the US on the German ground. Now, I will now look at 3 West German housing programs funded by counterpart funds. These projects aimed at the vague mid-century concept of livability, meaning an adequately high standard of living for the populations they housed. By encouraging entrepreneurship, home ownership, and consumption at the expense of autarkic and informal economic activities, the ECA and later MSA targeted volatile populations, refugees, such as in the Schleswig-Holstein projects to the left, the poorly housed in general, such as in the ECA projects in the center, and minors in the Ruhr, the MSA housing projects, minors housing projects to the right, aiming to improve their lives while simultaneously, quote, breaking, unquote, conservative West German building practices. And this was really a word that they used. They used words such as, American administrators used this word, breaking building traditions. I begin with the Schleswig-Holstein refugee housing projects. Now, in 1949 to 1950, the ECA released 250 million Deutsche Mark in Marshall Plan counterpart funds for housing, with 100 million earmarked to build dwellings in the distressed lands of Schleswig-Holstein, Lower Saxony, and Bavaria, and then 150 million for the purpose of housing on a general social basis throughout the whole of the German Federal Republic. So on the one hand, there was housing for the whole of Germany, and then there were these housing programs. From this came the largest housing program of the immediate post-war period in West Germany, the special program for the building of 10,000 dwellings for refugees, what I just simply referred to as the Schleswig-Holstein refugee housing projects. At the encouragement of the US ECA's Office of Labor Affairs, the Social Democratic chairman of the newly founded German Trade Union Confederation, Hans Buckler, led a group of trade unions in Schleswig-Holstein to take responsibility for the program, forming the Working Group for Productive Refugee Assistance, in the fall of 1949. And I quote here, "In the long run, refugees cannot be helped indefinitely through the means and methods of public welfare, but only by incorporating them into the living and working community of their homeland. Displaced persons and immigrants must find work so that they can develop their strengths productively and thus create the foundations of an existence through their own efforts. In the big picture, the refugee problem is therefore primarily and above all a problem of the capacity of the West German labor market, but in extension, it's almost a problem for Europe itself. The program's emphasis on productive help derived from the insight that, from these insights that I just read, and the program's authors aimed at realizing the labor potential of the 40,000 refugees present in Schleswig-Holstein in 1949, where almost all of the refugees from all over Germany had clustered after the war. And the idea was locating them closer to the industrial centers of the land, which had been severely damaged during the war. To them, the problem of work for refugees was a problem of housing procurement, literally a housing construction problem. And at the same time, the ECA saw the proposals as compatible with the Marshall Plan. Refugee aid was linked to an increase in productivity, and therefore taxpayer dollars would not be provided for relief, but for capital investment that would in turn transform refugees into productive workers. The ECA's views would, however, soon change. The 88.5 million program consisted of 40 million of ERP funds, combined with local funds, public and private, to make up the rest. So counterpart funds are only bringing, a counterpart of the 40 million from the pockets of others in order to make the money do almost double duty. The ECA made two conditions for the financing. First, the FRG should support refugees for productivity in the long term. And then the second the ECA made it a condition that the funds used for refugee housing should be used rationally. That is, there should be a decisive progress in lowering construction costs through rationalization of the construction industry. The AFP accomplished this by producing 10,000 refugee apartments in 6 apartment types in a single large-scale construction project all over Schleswig-Holstein. The large building sites enabled economies of scale. They saved money through large-scale construction technology, combining transport and the rationalization of building sites. The AFP offered the standardized components of a few uniform apartment types up for tender. enabling industry to produce in large series and thus eliminating middlemen. The AFP limited construction costs to 6,750 Deutsche Mark per 2.5 room, 50 square meter unit. At the time, the average Schleswig-Holstein cost was 8,500 per unit, whereas the average in the Federal Republic was as high as 10,000, so 6,750 to 10,000. Most of the refugee housing projects were built in a nondescript kind of non-modernist style, similar to what one might perhaps have seen in neighboring Denmark at the time, with steeped pitched roofs covered in roofing tiles, thick masonry walls, and thick framed windows. Nobody's idea of modern architecture. The lack of protrusions and horizontal banding, however, still lends them kind of an austere quality, I would say. Now, even before construction began on the Schleswig-Holstein projects, a separate building program was underway. A US government communication dated October 25, 1949, a year before the first West German building law, discussed the possibility of making available to German authorities the advice and knowledge of US city planning and housing experts that, quote, Chancellor Adenauer displayed the greatest interest in this problem and would welcome any expert advice from the US, unquote, and that, quote, exchange or unilateral programs which are developed or implemented by the United States will have the Chancellor's full support, unquote. And I therefore move over to the next set of projects, the ECA development projects. Is anyone here from Germany by any chance? No. The ECA development projects, 15 settlements by more or less famous West German architects in 15 major West German cities, are pretty well known in Germany and even in the wider European architectural history, let's say. When West German historians mention the ECA projects, they register as almost an anomaly, as an American hobby horse, to use the bitter phrase used by the West German administrators that resented the projects. This is because despite the project's picturesqueness, the ECA projects represented only a fraction of West German dwelling built in 1951. In West German building programs of 1949 and 1950, apart from the Schleswig-Holstein projects, counterpart funds only funded 10% of the building costs of each project. Other German funds covered the rest. This meant then that the counterpart funds went a much longer way, since each counterpart fund dollar was matched 10-1 by local financing, but the US could still say no. So they would control they would give the kind of the critical margin of error that would make a project possible. This also implied a trade-off for the US. American experts, they lost control of the building site to some extent, even though that in 1949 to 1950, the ECA insisted on both approving every project and that it carried the ERP logo. This loss of control contributed to bitterness among US administrators who resented that US dollars were lost in the wash of other German financing and that wasteful and corrupt German building practices were being further subsidized through US taxpayer funding, and to make matters worse, being advertised as such. It's for this reason that the administrators produced the idea of a small program financed entirely out of counterpart funds and entirely controlled by the Americans to pursue every measure, and now I quote, to break traditional building methods. This is the American hobby horse that the Germans so resented. The ECA projects, along with the MSA projects that followed, and I will soon tell you what those were, they would be American projects built by Germans. They were the clearest examples of the US commissioning architecture outside of its borders during the Marshall Plan. They were not a charitable exercise, but meant to test whether it would be possible to create a new housing model outside of stringent German building traditions and regulations, one that would allow taxpayer dollars to travel further to house Germany's unhoused population and render it productive. The ECA project should also be seen through the frank lenses of both US housing expert Bernard Wagner, who was on the housing jury that selected the architects for the ECA projects. He had made the point that, quote, separation could not easily or usefully be made between technical research and housing and building in general, unquote. And his boss at the Housing and Home Finance Agency in Washington, controlling the kind of the international efforts of Americans in the housing scene abroad, he had also described this as akin to technical assistance in reverse. So almost like making experiments outside of your borders and then learning from those, since doing these experiments on Americans would not be popular. So according to both points, the ECA development projects emerge as gigantic research projects, let's say, on one-to-one scale. They represented a chance for American housing experts, many of whom knew that American building practices, despite American confidence at mid-century, were not necessarily on par with US political, economic, and military standing. And they allowed him to improve on these practices by producing architecture they would not have been able to produce at home. Here we see some stills from the publications. Now, before turning to the Ruhr miners' housing projects, which I will conclude with, it's worth visiting a very fun exchange episode between the ECA's labor division in Paris and the ECA's special mission to Germany and Frankfurt about the Schleswig-Holstein refugee housing projects versus the ECA development projects. And in this exchange, Donald Munson, who was a housing consultant for the labor division of the ECA and member of the committee of experts for the ECA project competition, along with Bernard Wagner, he effectively disinvited himself from further influence on ECA-sponsored building activities in West Germany through criticizing American work from the inside. And I kind of discovered this as a kind of an exchange of letters in the US archives, and I was kind of thrilled that discovering this. It almost reads as a kind of a minor novel, let's say. Now, Monson was an architect and planner educated at the Illinois Institute of Technology, where he studied under Mies van der Rohe and Ludwig Hilbersheimer. And from 1950 to 1952, he traveled widely in Europe, surveying housing construction conditions, where he, for example, wrote this approving article about the Schleswig-Holstein projects. And I think you can kind of hear that it's kind of a sympathetic figure to me. He's a kind of a social democrat and a very kind of very rare, I would say, someone open to other forms of architectural organization, let's say, in the US government in 1950, where everyone is turning towards what he would call a full liberalization of the housing market. Therefore, Monson was something of a Trojan horse in the committee of experts for the ECA project competition. In August of 1951, the European Labor Division of the ECA sent him on an interim appointment to Frankfurt between an assignment to review the French housing situation and his services on the ECA development projects jury, which were about to begin in September. The Labor Division assigned Monson to investigate the German trade union plans for the Ruhr miners' housing, which were supposed to be based on the demonstration housing projects. Correspondences between Monson and his colleagues in Paris on the one hand, and the chief of the ECA special mission in Germany and Frankfurt on the other, tells a riveting tale of how the German trade union's proposal for miners' housing in the Ruhr on the line of Schleswig-Holstein was overtaken by American ideas embodied by the ECA development housing projects. The accounts amount to nothing less than a tale of two housing systems, a centrally planned system on the left and a free market system on the right. By rejecting the centrally planned system and affirming the single-family owner-occupied system, the ECA hoped to spur the latter in West German housing as well. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the time to review the correspondence here in all its glory, but the two sides debated about the use of counterpart funds. Monson admired the Schleswig-Holstein projects and encouraged the West German labor movement to develop similar projects in the Ruhr. When he learned that the ECA housing division had soured on the projects because they were insufficiently liberal and wanted to apply the lessons of the ECA development project instead, he grumbled in a letter to his colleagues in Paris. The projects are too scattered, and I'm reading now from the screen. The projects are too scattered to have any central purchasing or to justify the purchase of expensive earth-moving machines. If an organization can control the building in a concentrated area of a large scale, then their capital expenses become possible. We might be able to turn out buildings in the first year by putting ECA funds into capital equipment at the same cost it would take to build if we put the same amount into mortgages directly. At the end of the year, we would have an organization with assets which would enable it to continue even if we could give no further counterpart aid. Now, Monson was ill-disposed towards the ECA development projects for which he was a jury member, and he saw the already completed Schleswig-Holstein projects as superior economically, and he criticized the former behind the scenes and hoped they would not become a model for the ECA-funded projects, because ultimately the ECA did not want an organization with assets that would enable it to continue. Unfortunately for him, ultimately they did, with the ECA special mission to Germany having the upper hand. And now I will read a quote again. The ECA projects are a market success, eminently satisfactory from a cost and administrative standpoint that has had more influence on community and housing circles than anything else that has been attempted. We have gotten far more favorable publicity on this one project than in probably all other projects combined, with the exception of the ECA projects. The ECA has not received any credit for the housing programs we have financed. Now, this was true, of course, up to a point, but the opposite could also have been shown to be the case, that even projects that have received a small amount of funding were made to carry ERP logos and could therefore have been said to have overrepresented, not underrepresented, the ECA. Harris had therefore requested that the miners' housing projects be conducted in such a manner that the ECA does not receive only the credit, but also that it be done in a form so that the houses will always be known as ECA financed. Reading between the lines, the MSA projects were supposed to be more than mere houses with logos and billboards saying "Hier hilft der Marshallplan." Rather, the buildings themselves were supposed to be billboards. As it was conducting the competition for the ECA projects and initiating their construction in 1951, the ECA was preparing similar settlements for miners' housing in the Ruhr. And perhaps that was always the end goal. At the end of 1951, as the Marshall Plan formally ended, the ECA was abolished and the Mutual Security Agency founded in its stead, and the miners' housing projects became associated with this agency, and I will refer to them as the MSA, miners' housing projects, or the MSA projects. In 1952, the MSA's special mission to Germany made 100 million available in the form of counterpart funds to promote the idea of home ownership and raise the standard of housing for coal miners in West Germany. The MSA Ruhr Miners housing projects consisted of 9 housing projects in Ruhr cities and towns, each within walking distance of several functioning mines to reduce miners' dependency on any one mine. Now, this is so that, essentially it creates a kind of a free market for labor. They really didn't like the idea that of factory housing where miners were bound to one mine. They provided in total 5,000 miners' dwellings with a habitable floor area between 54 and 115 square meters. The average apartment was 70 square meters. The average lot was 240 square meters, and the average garden was 150 square meters, and gardens were kind of important here. In 1954, the Minister of Housing published a book on the miners' housing projects titled Eigenheime für den Bergmann, containing a series of articles by German contributors. It was primarily a book by Germans for Germans, and it documented the now completed projects thoroughly. The publication claimed that the representatives of the MSA housing branch, the Federal Housing Ministry, and the Ministry of Reconstruction of the land that made up the Central Committee were responsible for approving the planning and proposals of local committees, including, quote, including the selection of sites, architects, and building associations, determining the financial arrangements and general control over the execution of the program, and that, quote, it initiated a survey on the miners' housing needs and desires in order to create a yardstick in measuring the value of the proposed plans and improvements, unquote. The committee consulted with consultants who had been part of the ECA evaluation committee, not Donald Monson this time, but for the sake of expediency, the architects of the MSA projects were simply chosen from among the architects who had obtained the first, second, or third prize in the ECA competition. The MSA projects, like the ECA projects, were as much exhibition projects for propaganda purposes as they were for efforts to combat a German housing crisis. Through transforming the miners' living environment, the miners' lives in turn would be transformed, and with it, the idea of Western Europe. In the years preceding the erection of the MSA projects, West Germany and the European coal and steel community arose as not only friendly competitors to the US, but as potential allies in the recently hot Cold War. The industrial base of this competition was the Ruhr mines. The MSA projects were a key interface between nature and culture, production and consumption, mine and stove. They were deliberated and debated and even fought over on every stage. What American administrators hoped to accomplish with the projects was not always clear to those involved, in the least to the Germans, who did not acquiesce to everything that the MSA told them to do. The MSA projects therefore come into focus as ambiguous objects, at once a world to come, but also for the USA administrators, a road not followed. Now, how much time? I'm realizing I'm going, I have like 10 more minutes.
Like 20 minutes.
Is 10 going on for 10 more minutes okay? Am I boring you?
No.
Now, because to conclude, I would like to zoom in on the last so-called ninth project, what the US administrators also referred to as the model housing project, or for our purposes, the Dortmund project. So they're kind of constantly iterating these housing projects. So from Schleswig-Holstein, they're learning from that. They iterate to the ECA projects, then they go to the the 8 MSA projects, and then they decide we want to do it one more time, and we want to do it just right for this Dortmund project. It began after the other 8 MSA projects had been accomplished and was supposed to be the culmination of the knowledge gathered not only in the first 8 projects, but in all the projects before them. Now, I've told you about how US administrators wrangled about the most minute aspects of the houses in their efforts to control the lifestyles of people on the other side of the planet. Bernhard Wagner, the housing specialist assigned to the projects, wrote a series of reports for the project. In one of them, he wrote about the special interest of the MSA, the basementless house. For the Dortmund project, for the first time, the housing section planned 2 dwelling types without basements. He gave 5 reasons for this. I list them up here. First, the MSA wanted to heat the Dortmund project with a district heating plant, doing away with the need for a heater and coal storage in each house. Second, there was a washing machine in the kitchen or utility room, so the housewife did not need to inconvenience herself by going down to the basement laundry room. Third, there were plenty of built-ins above ground providing for storage closer at hand, so you didn't need storage in the basement. Fourth, it saved housewives step climbing. And of course, fifth, eliminating the basement saved money that could be spent instead on technological advances, such as a better refrigerator and a better washing machine, in a kind of productivity by technology feedback loop. Beyond this, the US government Housing and Home Finance Agency, for whom Bernard Wagner worked when he wasn't on loan to the ECA, was interested in houses without basements in the US in the Marshall Plan years. An issue of its technical bulletin from 1948, the same bulletin as Bernard Wagner actually contributed to, so he would have known it, had an article in 3 parts titled Basements versus No Basements for Houses. The article touts all the benefits of what Wagner mentioned in his report. Now, although the lack of a basement was a defining feature of houses built in the US during the post-war building boom of the 1940s and 1950s, at the time of the article's publication, the US building industry had been churning out basementless houses for decades. Sears, Roebuck's, and Co.'s basementless Crafton was possibly the best-selling Sears modern home, whereas Cliff May's more bespoke California ranch-style houses of the 1930s identified the lack of basement with modernity. In 1947, Levittown began construction, revolutionizing home building in the US. The Levittown homes were, of course, basementless. Now, it may be obvious to all of you, but a basementless house means that utilities have to be on the ground floor. What is prime ground floor space, with the footprint of the house having to be enlarged to accommodate for this being under one roof with the living spaces. And this, of course, increases the basementless houses' cost, especially where land is at a premium. A single floor house in a moderate climate only requires a slab on grade. The savings in materials and labor from speedy construction provide part of the savings of the basementless house. So basements and crawl spaces are therefore always somewhat too large relative to the size of the floor space above. Do you follow? You're always, because you're having to replicate the floor plate below. Yes?
But I have a question.
Yes?
Because in some places, for instance, in the US,
yes.
The basement exists not only for technical reasons, but because regulation. In very cold places,
yes.
The pipelines need to be at least a meter or a meter and 20 under the ground so that the water won't freeze.
Yes.
So that means that if you already have to...
You already have the... Yes, you already have it.
So you do the basement because you already have half of it or more than half of it there.
Exactly, yes.
But in Germany, was that the case?
In Germany, it was also more, it was not regulations, but it was still, more practical. It was just something that they had been doing, they had always been doing this. So for this very reason, this was very much resisted, and it was never, they didn't like it. So yes. So it was never adopted. But okay, so I was going to go on to say exactly that you said. The article argues that when the builder adds a story to have 2 or more stories to the house without a basement, then the savings are not enough when compared to the deeper footings required by, the 2-story house. So regardless of whether or not there's a basement or not, since the cost of adding the basement is negligible relative to the cost of the deepened footings. I mean, this is getting a little technical, but this is kind of, I have to go there. I'm sorry about that. So these are the intricacies of the basementless house at the beginning of the Cold War. But beyond these kind of technical and economic aspects, and now I promise I'm almost done. A basementless house also denotes modernity. In the photographs of Levittown, the construction's momentum is somehow carried forward in the form of the house itself. But not only that, the basementless house rests on the ground instead of being rooted, implying the mobility of the Western frontier as opposed to the rootedness of the New England house, such as you were referring to, Reina, with its deep, dank basement. The basementless house's rootedlessness did the opposite in the case of miners' housing in Germany, however. It tied the German miner to his house by tying him, to the market economy. The basementless house not only broke German building norms, the miner's house, but also his traditions, and with them, his life. Many miners wanted to keep animals, but they also wanted to grow vegetables in their gardens, not in the least potatoes, which they traditionally stored in the Kartoffelkeller, along with the Kohlendeputat, which was what they got for free from the mine for his basement boiler. All of these are kind of aspects of the informal economy that the US administrators couldn't stand. Wagner's reasons 1 and 5 address both these issues directly. In the case of the first, basementless house plus refrigeration, where the savings of going basementless were used to buy a refrigerator, potentially replaced cool basement food storage, doing away with the miner's potato garden. Not only would the miner's potatoes require many refrigerators to keep them intact over winter, but as any home cook living in a basementless house will know, potatoes do not store well in the refrigerator because the excessive cold breaks down their starches, causing them to develop an unpleasant sweet flavor. Reading between the lines of Wagner's reports, the innocuous proposal of basementless house plus refrigeration, by doing away with the miner's potato garden, was an expansive provocation. It envisioned the wholesale transformation of West German society from a traditional to a consumer society. Since there was no longer a potato storage next to the miner's garden, there was no use in growing potatoes. The basementless house required frequent trips to the supermarket to buy a small batch of potatoes, now industrially grown on land tilled by industrial machinery, paid for by Marshall Plan counterpart funds, or whichever starch the consumer desired. Italian spaghetti, for example, once West Germany was a member of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. The miner, no longer preoccupied with his potato garden in his after hours, developed new uses for his leisure time, complete with the entertainment trappings of a post-war consumer society, radio, and later television, advertising further products which took up more and more of his leisure time. This also meant a transformation of the miner's diet from a garden and chicken coop in the garden to a supermarket diet. The miner's substitution of a motorcycle for goats, pigs, or chickens, as I discussed elsewhere, facilitated trips to the supermarket to buy eggs, bacon, and potatoes. On the scale of the national economy, the transferal of homegrown potatoes to industrially grown potatoes was symbolic, beyond the strictly macroeconomic, for its incorporation of domestic informal labor into the formal economy. This freed up man hours for quantifiable activities, including conspicuous consumption, which called for further consumer products, contributing to further economic growth. Such was also the case of Wagner's fifth point. The district heating plant did away with the Kohlendeputat, which was the coal that he received free from the mine. The MSA tried to eliminate such in-kind privileges where it could, by transferring the Kohlendeputat back to the mine, resulting in higher taxable wages for the miner, which could then be used towards heating from the district heating plant instead. US administrators would have seen this as a more efficient use of coal, not only doing away with the man hours associated with transporting, installing, and then burning 800 furnaces for 50 plus years, but putting them to more productive use, again, contributing to economic growth. Now, Wagner did, of course, not expand on any of this, but in hindsight, we can read another motive in between the lines of Wagner's dream of basementless houses for miners. Despite the MSA's pride in the fact that the miner was not tied down to any one mine, since at least two of them are within 20-minute walking distance in each direction, the MSA was not afraid to tie the miner and his family down to their own house. This is why Wagner elsewhere insisted on district heating, even when the German contractor threatened to tear out the radiators and go back to installation of coal stoves because it was much cheaper. In a Ruhr, where the miner was able to transport his coal from one rental to the next, all the rental requires is a rudimentary stove. The cost for heating was therefore externalized and left to the informal economy, leading to lower square footages per dwelling lower rents, lower wages, and more mobility for the miner. A low-cost rental with a high degree of mobility was a thorn in the side of the MSA, as this would lead to an uprooted population more susceptible to labor organizing. Now, to conclude, from grant strategy to the single-family house for home ownership in Dortmund, the dollars paid to farmers in the US hinterland became architecture anyway, by providing incentives by local architects, builders, and even miners themselves to adopt US techniques. This is how a sack of grain becomes a building, but I'm glad that I was able to bring you back to potatoes. Thank you very much. Well, that was a lot, and I'm probably almost done with my time.
Maybe we have time for one question, one or two further questions from you.
I have another question.
Yes?
Should I have another question?
No, but I was wondering because you did, I mean, thank you for the presentation. I mean, considering what's happening now,
Yes.
you both, let's say, economic sort of policy aspect, climate emergency, and sort of waste of time.
Yes, yes.
Back to the garden.
Yeah, yes, 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 yes.
So, like, it's super interesting to see that this is really a span of less than, like, 20 years.
Yes, yes.
You know, like from one to the old settlement. And which is like the US is trying to sort of embed this waste of life. You said something that it's like quoting them. Like they were against, let's say, German construction tradition, where they wanted to impose American construction tradition.
Yeah.
My experience on American construction tradition is like, how you say, cardboard.
Yes, yes, yes.
American constructions is usually like a more metal,
Yeah.
with very light, you know, structures. It's almost like everything is, you know,
Yeah.
cardboard. So what kind of constructive traditions were they talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said this very briefly somewhere, you know, that there is a, it's as if the administrators themselves that are not architects, they don't realize actually how inferior American building tradition construction is to compared to Germany. And for example, there are some hilarious moments in the archive where this person, Donald Monson, who studies under Hilbersheimer and Mies, you know, so he's learning from, you know, learning from them. He knows the excellence, and then he's kind of trying to say, look, we should not be like, because at that point they want to bring a exhibition on U.S. urbanism to Germany, you know, and he's trying to say it in a very polite way that look, we should not be exporting our urbanism here, you know, and it's exactly the same with these building traditions. So I mean, these are, but at the same time, there's like an intense kind of experimental like with the basementless house, you know, this journal, you know, so there is a kind of intense experimental tradition, let's say, being developed, and they're eager to try and find where they can apply them. And because of the market-based approach in the US, they're unable to kind of try them out. So they are only able to use the US as Europe as a one-to-one scale experiments, really. So that's why they wanted, they didn't, that's why they really resented the Schleswig-Holstein projects, because they were based on German techniques, and they ended up in more or less kind of German, let's say, sorry to use that word, aesthetics, you know. Thank you for the question. Yes, yes. Yeah. Any other questions? Was it confusing, the kind of the ECA projects to the MSA projects to the Schleswig-Holstein projects? I realized when I was talking, it must be very hard to kind of remember which ones were which and stuff like that.
Did you think that how they are different?
Yes.
Because the discussions, the discussion on control is different than each. So that means
Yeah.
to identify.
To identify.
Yeah.
Yeah, so many acronyms. That's kind of what happens when you're writing about this period. And in the mid-century, they loved these acronyms, this MSA, ECA, all this stuff. They just. So my dissertation is like an alphabet soup.
I have a question in terms of, thanks for your lecture. A question in terms of methodology.
Yes.
How do you move your first steps in this research? I mean, I think like by following the dollars,
Yes.
was a interesting like investigating strategy, but how did you move from like economic history and political history to the architectural history? How you did this step?
Yeah, I mean that was why I started with the pervs thing, because I discovered it at the very beginning and I thought, this is great, I'm going to find all sorts of stuff like this, and then I never found anything again. I never found any architect talking about the Marshall Plan again. But then I knew that somehow it existed, because all this money had been spent somehow. So then I just had to go to the archives of, like, usually this would be like state archives of, Ministry of Reconstruction in France, or the Reconstruction Ministry in Germany, and just find.
So most of them you were based in Europe for the architectural part.
I was. That's actually strangely, a lot of it was. I always had counterpart in Europe and in Washington DC. So most of the work is done in Washington DC, but sometimes it's really intense. Like sometimes I'm writing a paragraph and I'm using a letter from Germany, a letter from Washington DC at the same time, So yeah, but it's strangely non-architectural. I mean, it took me a very long time to get to the architecture, I have to say. And sometimes the best way the US archives are completely impenetrable. So sometimes you just have to find something that someone else has written and go with that into the archive, and then you go from there, Yes.
He's writing about, the American home and the American community and the technical door.
Yes.
The home of the house and the great peaceful, etc. Banham is actually the video.
Yes.
Well, this is happening.
Yes, yes.
So,
yeah, yeah. I mean, but is he then not looking at the kind of the same technology as is being described in the basementless house, would you say, in some sense? Yeah. Yeah.